Introduction to our analysis of the May 28th meeting. Here we come to one of two very important events regarding this topic. The other is the July 9th Ritvik Representative Appointment Directive. Srila Prabhupada arrived in Vrindavan the day after he said he would be leaving this world soon. Within days, most of the GBC members also came to Vrindavan. By May 28, 1977, at least 19 to 20 GBC men out of a total of approximately 22 at the time had gathered in Vrindavan. After the initial shock and horror of coming to terms that Srila Prabhupada would be leaving soon, there were a number of practical issues that the GBC wanted his final guidance on. The GBC met first among themselves and discussed what issues required the attention of His Divine Grace and what questions they needed to ask him and resolve before he departs. These GBC men came up with a handwritten list of questions to ask, which was displayed on the screen. Out of this list, only two questions, question number 3 and number 4 on the list, deal with the disciplic succession or initiations after Srila Prabhupada departs, which is, of course, the issue this presentation is concerned with. The first two questions on the list were in regard to the GBC. So, if the order of the questions and the order in which the questions were asked is of any indication, it would appear that the GBC were more concerned about learning how long the GBC members would remain in their position than they were about how initiations would go on. It was decided to send a small delegation to meet with His Divine Grace and ask these questions, with one of the members designated to write up a report that would document what his responses were to those questions. And that document is what the rest of the GBC would then get and understand what Srila Prabhupada's answers were. At least the following 5 men, GBC men, attended: Tamal Krishna Maharaj, Satsvarup Goswami, Bhagawan Prabhu, Kirtananda Swami, Rameshwar Maharaj, and the Veda base also mentions Bhavananda saying a few words, but the words are buried in the background noise, so I am not sure that it was him speaking or not. As noted, the GBC wrote down only 2 questions to ask regarding the topic of initiations, and those are questions number 3 and 4 on the list. With question number 3, the GBC wanted to know what the process would be for conducting initiations after he departs. Clearly, this question goes to the very heart of the issue. That is why this meeting and the actual understanding of what Srila Prabhupada said, what his answer really was, is so pivotal to this issue. Obviously, Srila Prabhupada's answer to this direct question would fully resolve this entire issue. The problem is, however, that Srila Prabhupada's reply to that question has been debated and redebated, analyzed and reanalyzed hundreds of times by at least hundreds or even thousands of devotees over the past 43 plus years, with both sides on this issue claiming that Srila Prabhupada's words support their opposing views. And the fact is, the way in which the questions were asked and answered, and some of the mistaken use of the words, it can be easily argued that Srila Prabhupada gave answers supporting both the Ritvik system and that these men would become regular gurus. But that wouldn't make sense. Before I go any further, I need to bring up here why, in this presentation, I have taken time to document that prior to this meeting, there is significant and credible evidence indicating that His Divine Grace had, in fact, discussed that he was considering appointing men to act as what at the time he had called Ritvik Acharyas, who would continue to perform the initiation ceremonies on his behalf after he departs, where those who are initiated become disciples of His Divine Grace. The evidence shows that he had discussed this with Tamal Krishna, who was acting as Srila Prabhupada's personal secretary, Gauridas Pandit, who was both assisting Srila Prabhupada's secretary, Tamal Krishna, and was also acting as Srila Prabhupada's personal servant at the time, was the only other devotee personally present when Srila Prabhupada discussed this unique system of initiation. Tamal Krishna then discussed this idea with at least several other members of the GBC, and therefore at least some of the GBC men were aware of this when they went into the meetings on May 28th. One problem or contention is that the GBC have, in the past, completely denied that this had taken place. And even to this date, I know of no time where the GBC has officially admitted that Srila Prabhupada had indeed spoke of this before the May 28th meeting. There have been several individual GBC members who have admitted that the evidence does seem to indicate that this has taken place, but I don't believe the GBC as a body has officially recognized this. Nor do I know of any of the GBC men who were members at that time who have come forward and admitted that this is what took place, except for Tamal Krishna, who had done so in that December of 1980. As I've just previously showed, Gauridas Pandit, Jasodanandan Prabhus, presented their evidence and their side of the story at the 1990 North American GBC meetings, but the GBC rejected his account of what took place. At times, the GBC have belittled Gauridas Pandit, referring to him as a junior devotee, who at the time didn't hold any managerial position in ISKCON. He was acting as Srila Prabhupada's personal servant at the time, and acting as the personal assistant to Srila Prabhupada's personal secretary, but those positions held no managerial authority. Therefore, the GBC have dismissed Gauridas Pandit Prabhu's version of what he has insisted as to what Srila Prabhupada had said prior to this meeting in May. And also what Gauridas Pandit says, what Srila Prabhupada said in the meetings that led up to, as he dictated, the July 9th letter. Does it really matter if Srila Prabhupada had spoken about this before May 28th meeting or not? Even if he had. If he hadn't finalized it, then when he was asked in a formal meeting what he wanted, he may have decided not to go that path. So does it really matter one way or the other if he had talked about this before or not? Yes, it does. And as much as it will help us to make an acceptable and fair analysis of what was really being discussed during this May 28th meeting. It matters in order for us to reach the correct conclusion as to what Srila Prabhupada was really saying at this meeting. Hare Krishna. I am making an audio insert here in order to add additional clarity to the point I just made and to add another, actually most important point that it looks like I may have missed. As I just pointed out, knowing that Srila Prabhupada had been discussing a Ritvik system prior to this May 28th meeting will clarify what his answers really were. But I wanted to additionally emphasize that knowing this, first of all, allows us to understand what the GBC was really asking Srila Prabhupada that day. Understanding the real nature of the two and only just two questions that the GBC came up with to ask His Divine Grace regarding this most important topic is absolutely needed in order to more properly understand Srila Prabhupada's answers. And the evidence proves that the nature of those two questions was that the GBC were asking about the Ritvik system that Srila Prabhupada had just told Tamal just days earlier that he was planning to implement. And secondly, and more importantly, I wanted to add here how significant it is that Srila Prabhupada had been discussing such an ongoing Ritvik system of initiations, where he would appoint Ritviks who would perform the ceremonial aspects of the initiations on Prabhupada's behalf, which will allow His Divine Grace to continue to initiate his own direct disciples even after he departs from this world. The most profound significance that Prabhupada had discussed this prior to this meeting is that it totally vacates and defeats all of those who insisted that such an ongoing system is just bogus, bogus, bogus. And therefore, they have argued that such an idea has to be rejected because Srila Prabhupada would never have proposed such a totally bogus system. That argument is annihilated by the evidence that shows that Srila Prabhupada had, for a fact, spoke of implementing this exact system just several days prior to this meeting that was held on May 28, 1977. As I will soon be pointing out, the conversation that day only, and I must emphasize, it only makes any real sense if the GBC had, for a fact, known prior to this meeting that Srila Prabhupada had indeed been discussing such a Ritvik idea. As I will show, if he hadn't been discussing this, then the GBC and the GBC hadn't been aware of this, then key aspects of this conversation on May 28th would make absolutely no sense at all. And in fact, it would make the GBC look very foolish for asking what would then be stupid questions. Yet if the GBC knew that Srila Prabhupada had discussed this prior to this meeting, then we were left with another very nagging and bothersome question. Why had the GBC so strongly denied this in the past, and even to this day have not formally admitted that this is what took place? Have the GBC been trying to hide something? If this is what Srila Prabhupada had actually discussed, then at least some of the GBC knew this. Then why would they be denying it at all for all these years? Personally, I don't know the answer to that question. I can only make a guess. One reason may have been that after the May 28th meeting, they had come to the misunderstanding that Srila Prabhupada didn't really want those Ritviks to perform the ceremonies on his behalf, but that these men would soon, that he would soon name, would become regular gurus. So maybe they just felt that since, now they thought that Tamal had misunderstood what Srila Prabhupada was saying before the meeting. So then in an effort to dispel any misunderstanding, the GBC members just decided it was best just to deny that Prabhupada had ever said anything about this before, since they were now convinced that this wasn't the real understanding, that this is what he was actually saying on May 23rd. Anyway, the reason, I'm going to go off script a little bit, because the reason I really want to emphasize this is that it does make a difference, and there is substantial evidence that proves that he has said this. So it would be best, however, if those who know for certain, they would just come forward and they would explain. Some have also made a point that this was such an important issue. Why would Srila Prabhupada had discussed with only one GBC member, Tamal Krishna, and Gauri Das Pandit happened to be present also, but he wasn't a GBC. So they claim as some sort of proof that Srila Prabhupada would never have discussed this idea of a Ritvik representative system before with just one GBC member, that he would have to have discussed it at length with all the GBC and not just one member. But actually, a little knowledge of this situation at the time reveals it would have been totally understandable. At the time, Srila Prabhupada was extremely ill. He had come to Vrindavan to leave this world. Because his health was so weak, the GBC men were not freely going in to see him. When the GBC wanted to hold their last official meeting with him, they sent only 5 or 6 men due to Srila Prabhupada's ill health. Only a few men, Srila Prabhupada's personal servants, were going into his room on a regular basis, for his personal service, along with Tamal Krishna, who was acting as his personal secretary. And when Tamal would go, Gauri Das Pandit would join him as his assistant. And he was also acting as Prabhupada's personal servant. And this way, Tamal, being Prabhupada's secretary, then became the only member of the GBC who was going in to be with Srila Prabhupada on a regular basis at that time. And since he was acting as Srila Prabhupada's personal secretary, when Srila Prabhupada had something important to say regarding the future of his mission, it was natural for him to discuss these matters with his secretary, who was the only GBC who was going in to see him on a regular basis. He was also a member of the GBC, and he could relay this to the other GBC members. And it was the other GBC members, according to Gauri Das Pandit, or at least, a number of them were asking, asking Tamal, has Srila Prabhupada been talking about a successor? Is he going to appoint a successor? And they were asking Tamal to go in and ask Srila Prabhupada, and that is what he did on May 23rd. He asked Srila Prabhupada in his private meeting with Gauridas was there, if Prabhupada was going to be selecting a successor guru. Their concern was a successor guru, a single person. When we understand what the actual situation was at the time, then there was nothing unusual that Srila Prabhupada would have only been discussing this issue with Tamal at that time. He was the only person he was discussing any managerial issue, future managerial issues with at that time. Other than a few meetings he would have with a few others from time to time, Tamal was taking care of the important managerial matters for him. I have taken time to discuss this in the main body of the presentation because it is an important point that deserves the time and focus I am giving it. And to understand it, to really understand the situation and what was going on. My conclusion is that I accept Gauridas' claim that prior to this meeting, Srila Prabhupada had discussed selecting men who would act as Ritvik acharyas or Ritvik representatives who would initiate on his behalf, where he would remain the actual Diksha Guru after he leaves this world. During the May 28th meetings, and afterwards, the GBC were convinced that Srila Prabhupada didn't want them to initiate on his behalf after he leaves, that he wanted these men, these Ritviks, to become actual gurus. And therefore, they thought it would be best just deny that he ever said these things so it wouldn't just create confusion. They weren't trying to defiantly change what Srila Prabhupada wanted, but enough time spent on this. Let's move on. Coming up are even more profound points to present. The most important and significant part of my analysis of this meeting concerns what I have been referring to as the key that unlocks what Srila Prabhupada was actually saying that day in relation to this Ritvik Guru issue. This key changes everything. Let's hear the actual recording first. Then I will come back and reveal the key. And with the knowledge of that key, we will then dive deep into an analysis of this conversation.